Tonight, I'm inviting you into a quiet, candlelit corner of my life, the part I once hid behind folded hymns and polite smiles. It's a story about home, faith, and the kind of love that whispers before it ever dares to sing. It begins in a small church where sunlight gathered like dust on wooden pews, and with him, my pastor's son, whose laugh felt like Sunday morning. Our secret was tender, complicated, and braver than we ever expected. We learned slowly together. If this story touches you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps gentle stories find hopeful hearts across YouTube. I was 32 when I came home, a suitcase in my trunk and my mother's voice still soft in my ear from a phone call the night before. "Andrew," she'd said, "it would be nice to see you. The garden won't plant itself, and the house feels too quiet." It wasn't an emergency that brought me back, just the gentle ache of time nudging me toward the town that raised me. The road dipped and lifted, familiar as an old hymn, and the church steeple rose from the valley like the tip of a thumb pressed up toward the sky, steady and sure. It had been a decade since I'd sat in those pews, since I'd felt the wooden back beneath my palm while the choir sang and the pastor, steady as ever, told us to love our neighbors, to hold forgiveness like a candle in wind. I parked outside my mother's place, the same modest ranch with the bird feeder out front, and she came to the door wearing the cardigan she always wore when the weather couldn't decide whether it was spring or something colder. She hugged me and said, "You look older," and I laughed because we both did. We made tea, and she filled me in on everything the town had managed to accomplish without me, which was everything. The O'Keeffes had a new baby. Mrs. Layton's bakery had added a cinnamon roll that seemed to require a seatbelt. And the church, Pastor Green still preached, though he moved a little slower after his knee surgery, and his son, Eli, had moved back 2 years before to help him run the food pantry and the music on Sundays. At the sound of Eli's name, something old and tender pressed a finger against my ribs. I didn't say anything, only lifted my tea, but the past flickered across my mind like a film left in the sun. When we were teenagers, I thought I had invented the art of subtlety. I would stand near him after youth group, pretending to be deeply invested in plastic cups of fruit punch, while I tried not to notice the way his whole face smiled at once, the way he leaned when he listened, the way his voice held quiet, steady, like it had somewhere warm to rest. Back then, I had tucked my heart behind the shape of my best behavior, folded it into service projects and scripture memorization, and told myself that I was just grateful for a friend who made me laugh and sometimes looked at me like mourning. We were adults now. Whatever was behind us was a set of footsteps leading to the place we stood. I wasn't a boy with a secret anymore. I was a man with a life. I'd built it. An apartment with plants that lived, students who called me Mr. Lane and forgot my age like that made me immortal, friends who knew the shape of my laugh and the stories I loved to tell. I was out to them and to myself. I hadn't told my mother, not because she was unkind, but because I had built our conversations out of recipes and weather, and the carpenter in me feared removing any plank in case the whole thing groaned. On Sunday, the town looked exactly the way small towns do when they're trying their best to look like postcards. Children carried palm-sized Bibles, and older folks stood clustered at the entrance, hugging in a slow-moving traffic jam of affection. I took a seat in the 4th row because that's where the sunlight landed, and because that's where I had always sat, as though the act of returning could be as simple as folding into the old ways. The organ warmed the room, and the choir, faithful 20 or so, slipped into the hymn like they were walking into water they knew by heart, and there he was. Eli stood near the piano with a guitar strapped across his chest. He'd always been tall, but adulthood had given him a kind of quiet sturdiness. His hair was cropped a little shorter than I remembered. There was a small scar near his chin I didn't remember at all. He wore a crisp shirt with the sleeves rolled back like he'd been moving chairs before service, and the sunlight, rude in its honesty, landed on his jawline like a compliment. He sang the second verse, and the sound of his voice returned as if it had never left me, as if it had been a faithful tenant in the rooms of my head all along. The sermon was about the good that can grow from something broken. Pastor Green told the story of a cracked pot that watered the path as it walked, and though the water dripped out, flowers bloomed along the way. It was the kind of parable that sounded sweet and true, while you were sitting in a clean shirt, and complicated and true when you tried to live it on a Tuesday afternoon. I listened, and sometimes my eyes drifted toward Eli, and every time they did, he was looking down at the strings of the guitar, the shape of careful concentration making his mouth soft. After the benediction, the crowd slipped into that chaos small churches call fellowship, where everyone knows the names of the babies and the ailments of the grandfathers. I was halfway to the exit when I felt a hand on my sleeve. "Andrew Lane," a voice said, patient and surprised and warm all at once. I turned, and there he was, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "It's been a long time," he said. Elika Green. He was 31 now, I would later learn. And I was 32, and in that doorway we found ourselves adults, not boys with folded letters hidden in desk drawers. We made small talk the way people do when their memories are mixing with their manners. He asked about my work, teaching adult literacy in the city, and I asked about his, music, the food pantry, the Tuesday night discussion group that he promised was as gentle as a question mark. It would have been easy enough to let the conversation swim along on the surface. But then he said softly, "I'm glad you're back." It landed like a simple kindness, like the kind of sentence you're allowed to say in a church doorway. But something in the way he held the last word made it feel like a small light had been turned on in the corner of a room I thought I had locked. We exchanged numbers in a way that felt both casual and ceremonial. Later my phone lit with his message, and it was not scripture or a schedule, but a simple "coffee? It's been too long." He added a smile I felt all the way to my shoes. We met at the diner that still acted like time was a shy guest, sliding in only when invited. Eli sat across from me, and the opening minutes were full of the catch-up details you can hold up like IDs. Where we had been, the bits of the world we'd seen, the ones we'd lost, the ones we were trying to love well. He kept running his thumb along the edge of his napkin, a small rhythm he might not have noticed, and he laughed the way he always had. Like the sound remembered the way to the door. When the waitress brought our coffee, she set down a little bowl of sugar and a small pitcher of cream. The light caught the cream in the glass like it was trying to make a point about glory in ordinary things. We talked about the music at church, about a hymn his father insisted on for next week, about the pantry and the way people came through the doors with just enough hope in their eyes to make you want to hand them your coat and your car and the keys to whatever was locked. He asked about my students, and I told him how Saturdays began with gratitude letters, and how you could watch people straighten in their chairs when they wrote something true. We didn't say anything that first afternoon about the way the air felt between us, but we didn't need to. Sometimes the safest way to approach something holy is sideways. After an hour, he looked at his watch and winced. He was due at the church for a meeting about a fundraiser. "Come by," he said, then added quickly, "only if you want. Or I'll text you after and we'll walk. The river's still there. It hasn't gone anywhere." I did both. I stopped by the church and found him in the fellowship hall, troubleshooting the raffle baskets with a group of women who could plan a wedding in a blackout and have it look effortless. He moved through the room like someone who knew every name. He introduced me simply, and the women said the things women say when a boy comes back to town. "You've grown. Your mother must be so proud. Don't you dare leave without trying the lemon bars." By the time the afternoon softened its light, and the women declared their work superior to anything the town had ever seen, Eli and I were able to slip out and head toward the river, where the path was muddy with spring and the air carried that earthy, honest smell of thawing ground. We walked, we talked. The words felt like raindrops finding their way down a window, sometimes racing, sometimes hesitating, always collecting. We talked about faith, how it had kept us steady and how it had made us lonely. I told him about the quiet years, about the way I had set my alarm for joy and watched it skip town. He told me about coming back after years of study and the romance of returning to a place where everyone knew your name, until you remembered that meant everyone knew your business too. He didn't tell me everything, not then, but he did say, "I want to be honest, Andrew." He paused, looked out at the water as if the river could coach him through this. "I don't know what comes next for me. I know who I am. I know what I'm called to be. Some days those two things hold hands. Some days they nod at each other from across the room." The courage in that made my throat tight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. I didn't make a speech about all the ways I understood. Instead, I said the easy truth in a slow voice: "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. We can take this minute by minute if you want." He smiled, and it was so familiar that I had to put my hands in my pockets just so I could feel anchored to something. We stopped at the bend in the path where the trees make a tunnel, and the sky looks like someone laid a blue cloth over a secret. We were adults, standing on the river path with the whole of our histories collected in our knees, and when he reached for my hand, he did it like it was a question. I answered the only way I knew how. I held him back. If you were expecting fireworks, I could disappoint you, but what happened instead felt better. A quiet recognition, a relief like warm water over cold hands. Our first kiss, days later, happened in a place that couldn't belong to anyone else. The back corner of the church library, a room nobody used anymore except for the puzzle club and the Wednesday group that believed knitting could save the world. We had stayed late after a pantry night, shelving goods and wiping down tables. The building was a hush. He took my hand and led me into the library, where the old books made the kind of dust that highlights sunlight, as if it were a painter. "Andrew," he said, "my name, a prayer and a dare." I nodded. It was careful and kind and without urgency. We were two men, both fully grown, 31 and 32, making a promise with something as simple as yes. After that, life did what life does. It got complicated and unremarkable all at once. We texted at odd hours, funny photos of the pantry's donation bin when someone had left a shoe, a stanza from a poem I'd found scrawled in one of my students' notebooks, a photo of a sunrise he insisted was ordinary and which I assured him proved otherwise. We navigated. He had a family church, a father who believed the call to ministry included a life that looked a certain way. He had a mother who worried. He had a sister who was gentler than a lullaby and fiercer than thunder. I had my mother, who asked simple questions with complex timbre. "Are you happy?" she asked one night, watching me peel potatoes at her sink. "Some days," I said. "Some days it feels like I've wandered into the right room, and the music is already playing." She patted my hand with the dish towel. "Then dance," she said, and returned to her stew. Eli and I kept our joy small on purpose, not because it wasn't real, but because we wanted to protect it from the loudness of speculation. We chose the back booths at the diner and the river paths at dusk. We held hands inside our coat pockets. We found small ways to say "I see you" without making a speech. A lemon bar left in my mailbox. A paper crane folded from the church bulletin and slipped into my palm. My habit of leaving a book on the church steps for him to find, like a child sharing a secret by pretending it isn't one. We looked like two men who shared a sense of humor and a schedule. We were that. We were more than that. There were inevitably moments when the world tried to stretch us into shapes we didn't pick. Once at a potluck, Eli stood on one side of the room laughing with Mr. Garrison, the usher who insisted he was 65 when even the church's baptism registry knew better. A woman took my elbow and said, in a whisper that failed to be quiet, "You know, I always hoped Eli would find a nice girl. He needs someone to understand his heart." I smiled the polite smile of a man who has no intention of correcting the town during dessert. Later in the kitchen, washing dishes as the room emptied, Eli bumped my shoulder with his. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, then leaned in and said into the steam, "I do understand your heart." He dried a pot like it had misbehaved and said, "I know. The secret wasn't shame. It was strategy, A courtesy, perhaps, to people who needed a gentler runway and a way to give us time to know what this was without 1,000 opinions narrating our days. We didn't hide from everyone. He told his sister on a rainy Tuesday in her living room while their 2-year-old built a tower of blocks that collapsed every time he laughed too hard. She listened and then stood to hug him and me both without asking permission. "You look like yourselves," she said. "Would you like tea?" It was exactly the right sentence. We made a small ritual of Friday nights. I would stop by the church after the pantry closed, and we'd eat sandwiches in the back room with our feet up on folding chairs. We would talk about nothing and everything. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. He'd tune his guitar, and I would lean back and let the music braid itself into the story of my day. Once he sang an old hymn and changed a word here and there so that the phrase, "Come thou fount of every blessing," became, "Come thou fount of every lesson." And we laughed. I'm not a man who believes in omens, but I believe in noticing what grows. That winter, in the quiet corner we'd made for ourselves, the kind of love that whispers before it sings found its verse. It was not all gentle. Rumors in a town like ours move like smoke under a door. Someone saw us on the river path and did math that wasn't theirs to do. Someone else mentioned how often I'd been around the church, despite never managing to volunteer for the Wednesday flower committee. I didn't worry for me. I worried for him, because the son of the pastor, whether he asks for it or not, inherits a spotlight that prefers its stories simple. One afternoon, as snow refused to fall but insisted on threatening to, Pastor Green called me into his office. The desk, which I remembered as massive, looked smaller, or perhaps I had gotten bigger. The pastor poured 2 coffees and set them between us. He moved slower now, the aftermath of the surgery making his steps measured. "Andrew," he said, "you are a fine man. Your mother raised you well." My throat tightened for reasons he couldn't guess. He folded his hands, let the silence sit. He had always been good at that. Understanding that silence is where truth loosens its tie. "I hear things," he said. "A pastor always does." "Some of what I hear is nothing. Some of it is the early echo of something that matters. I want to ask you, not as your pastor, but as a man who holds something tender for my son. Is there something I should know?" I came to that room with rehearsed lines, or the polite responses a person can fit into a suit. I found I had no use for them. The truth, it turns out, does not need a tie. "Sir," I said, and the word felt honest, "your son deserves happiness that is protected and real. I care for him. We are building something. We're taking our time. We would never ask you to pretend you don't have your own wrestling to do. We're adults. We will be kind." He watched my face long enough for my heartbeat to build a new rhythm. He took a breath. "Kindness," he said, "is a holy posture." He sipped his coffee and smiled in a way that made the years show. "I love my son. I want to love him in the way he needs." "Give an old man a little time," I nodded. He added, almost playfully, "and don't kiss in the choir loft." The sopranos would never recover. I told Eli that night, over bowls of soup in my mother's kitchen, and he put his spoon down and turned his head like he could hear a faraway bell. "He didn't shout?" "He did not shout," I said. "He asked for kindness." We sat with that, 2 grown men in a kitchen that had seasoned 1,000 stories with salt and butter. Eli reached across the table and took my hand. We were not hiding. We were simply holding a fragile thing in a careful light. Spring arrived with the stubborn joy it always manages. The pantry's hours grew longer, because hunger does not respect seasons, and a storm strutted across the county one Thursday like it owned the place. It ripped a corner of the church's roof and sent shingles skittering like dark leaves. We gathered, a motley crew of volunteers, and we hauled tarps up ladders and handed up nails and steadied one another's shins and shoulders while the wind faked arguments it never intended to finish. Eli laughed more than he should have, and cursed less than he probably wanted to, and at one point he misjudged his footing and skinned his elbow. I was halfway up the ladder below him, and my hand reached for him out of reflex. He balanced and looked down at me with a grin that belonged in a photograph from a yearbook you never return. "Fine," he said, and I nodded. Later, When the roof was covered and the storm moved on to another town that had never asked for it either, we sat in the fellowship hall with plastic cups of water and cookies that tasted like sugar and relief. He leaned his head back on the metal chair, closed his eyes and said, "This is life, isn't it?" I nodded. "It's not a bad one," I said. The quiet in the days that followed felt earned, like a rest in a piece of music that allows you to hear the song more clearly. On a Tuesday evening in June, we sat on my mother's back porch and listened to the crickets show off. My mother stepped outside with 2 cups of chamomile tea, set them down, and said very simply, "Eli, your father stopped by this afternoon. He wanted to drop off a pie. He also wanted to tell me that he loves you." Eli stared at her, then at me. "He said that?" She nodded, her mouth opening around the smallest smile. "He said love is the only currency he's never worried about spending too freely." We didn't rush toward any announcement. We let the season do its work. Kindness, patience, humor. We built our days out of errands and whispers, and the people who mattered learned what we had to tell before anyone else did. Eli's mother cried a little, and then fetched a photo album, flipping to a picture of Eli at 7 in an ill-fitting tie. "I always knew your heart was bigger than your fear," she said, touching the photograph with a fingertip as if to calm a memory. She hugged me and then fussed about whether I had eaten enough, which in that family was the way you were welcomed as kin. The church did what churches do when they learn to hold more. Some people sighed in relief. Some people fidgeted at the edges and went very quiet. A few left, not with slammed doors, but with the kind of measured exit that says, "This is not my road right now." We wished them well and meant it. Pastor Green delivered a sermon about the wideness of love that did not mention us by name, but that told the truth anyway. He stood a little to the left of the pulpit because the sunlight came in funny on the right, and he said, "I have been wrong about things. I will be wrong again. God help me be wrong toward grace. If you are waiting for a dramatic moment, a stand at the front of the church, a declaration that made the rafters shake, there wasn't one. There were smaller moments with greater power, a handshake that lingered a second longer than necessary. A casserole left on a porch with a note that read simply, "We're glad you're here." 2 old men who used to sit at opposite ends of the pew, finding themselves in the center because it was the best place to hear Eli sing. We did not become a banner. We became a fact. Our love made the same groceries, folded the same laundry, argued about the same routes to the hardware store. It made the ordinary glow. That summer, I taught a community class on Tuesday evenings in the church basement, and Eli would come early to set up chairs. He'd make jokes about my lesson plans like they were recipes, and I'd remind him that he once sang an entire verse of a hymn with the wrong words, and nobody died. After class, sometimes we'd sit on the steps out front, the brick warm from the day, and watch the bats make fast decisions in the dusk. Once a boy in his 20s walked by and doubled back. "You're Mr. Lane," he said to me. "You taught me how to read a bus schedule when I was 19. He hesitated, then looked at Eli. "You sing like you mean it." We thanked him, and after he went on his way, Eli leaned close. "He's right," he whispered. "You taught me how to read a different kind of map." On our first anniversary, our private one, the date we counted from that kiss in the library, we drove to the lake. We packed sandwiches and a small watermelon that did not understand how round it was. My mother insisted on sending deviled eggs and a thermos of sweet tea, because apparently love required mayonnaise and sugar in equal measure. We sat with our feet in the water and talked about the next year, as if we could call it into being with our softness. He said he wanted to start a Saturday morning repair cafe at the church, a place where people who were tired of buying new could bring their old for the kind of fixing that lets a thing keep telling its story. I said I wanted to make a book of small essays, tiny love letters to the things that hold a life together. The kettle that whistles, the quilt that remembers, the worn edge of a pew where your hand knows where to rest. He grinned and pointed at our picnic. "Add deviled eggs to your list," he said solemnly. "They are the glue of our society. We were not perfect, We got tired. He worked too much. I worried too much. There were evenings when the door between us seemed to stick, and it took both of our hands to loosen it. Once after a long day, he snapped at me about the way I had folded the towels, like you're trying to engineer a structure instead of covering a body with softness, and I laughed when I shouldn't have. We both went quiet in the kind of silence that can get mean if you leave it alone too long. He went for a walk, and I stayed and stared at the towels like I had never seen cotton. He came back an hour later with flowers he claimed were on sale. "I'm sorry," he said. "I will always choose you over a towel." I said, "I'm sorry. I will try to remember that softness matters." We put the flowers in a mug and exhaled. Love, we learned, was not a performance. It was an agreement to live in the same weather and trust each other with the forecast. Somewhere in the middle of that second year, we began carving a home out of the next town over. A small farmhouse with floors that complained and windows that looked like always open eyes. The porch sagged with possibility. We painted the kitchen, a color that an optimistic clerk had named morning bread, which looked less like bread and more like a memory of warmth. People helped, because that's what people do when you allow them. My mother brought curtains and hung them with the authority of a person who had negotiated with dozens of windows. Eli's father came with a ladder and told stories about how his own first house had tried to blow away in a storm, until his wife had insisted on tying it down with geraniums. We moved in on a Saturday, and on Sunday we drove back for church because our leaving wasn't a leaving, just the right kind of distance for a new closeness. I sat in the fourth row like I always did, and I watched him sing. The sunlight found him the way it had the first Sunday I returned. But this time, when he sat, he glanced at me the way a person glances at a place where he knows there is water. After the benediction, a child ran up with construction paper hearts cut in joyful confusion. "I made these," she said to us both, "because love needs pictures." We pinned one to the church bulletin board and took the other home to the refrigerator, where it kept company with a grocery list and a postcard from a friend who believed in sending you a sky when you needed one. The work of our days settled into something like rhythm. I taught in the mornings and graded in the afternoons. He planned music and tended the pantry and, true to his word, launched the repair cafe. Saturday mornings became a hymn of fixing, toasters reborn, torn hems redeemed, toys reassembled from their sulk. A widower named Arthur came every week with an ancient lamp, and Eli always managed to convince the lamp it had more light in it than it believed. "You're a pastor of small things," I said to him once. He kissed my temple and said, "Small things are how big things prove they mean it." We visited his father on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes the visit was quiet, a game of checkers that ended with a stubborn king crowning himself twice. Sometimes it was an exchange of recipes with his mother, who swore she could taste mood in a pie crust. Once, months after that first conversation in his office, Pastor Green took my elbow in the kitchen while the kettle fussed. "Do you know," he said, "that you make my son breathe easier?" I looked at him and found a man who had learned to hold his own certainty loosely, like a bird. "He makes me breathe better too," I said. "We're learning together." He nodded, then added with a small grin, "Well, keep learning. And for heaven's sake, don't let him convince you that mayonnaise belongs in everything." Years slipped over us, like a blanket we pulled up under our chins. We had arguments we learned to end kindly. We sat on our porch when the sky was full of apology and beauty, and believed both could be true at once. We carved jack-o'-lanterns shaped like the faces we made when the other forgot a grocery item. We bought a dog from the shelter, a grey-muzzled gentleman named Harold, who refused to fetch anything but learned to bark at thunder like he could talk it down. We made friends with our neighbors, including a retired couple who moved their lawn chairs to face our garden just to offer commentary. Much of it incorrect, all of it affectionate. There were days when the past tapped us on the shoulder. A letter arrived from someone who had left the church the year before, full of apology that didn't require a reply. We sent one anyway, full of gentleness, because gentleness feels better when it finds its way to a mailbox. We ran into an old classmate at the grocery store who said, "You two were always bound to find each other," and then went on to ask whether gluten had always been the enemy. We attended a wedding where the bride's father cried into his boutonniere in the exact way a child tries not to. I do not know whether there is a word for the moment, a secret. Becomes a story and then becomes a life, but I know the feeling. It is the sensation of setting something heavy down without anyone accusing you of weakness. It is the sound of your own laughter returning, richer for having learned to go quiet when it needed to. It is the way the light in your kitchen changes at 5 o'clock and reminds you, without scolding, to turn toward the one you promised to turn toward, even if the promise was made in a library with dust dancing in the air and the world trying its best not to let you. One winter, the furnace broke during the coldest week of the year. We turned the oven on just to remind ourselves of the idea of heat, which my mother would have criticized if she had known, and which she did criticize once she found out, arriving with 2 space heaters and a bag of sweaters that had been waiting for their turn since the 80s. We slept in the living room that night, under a pile of blankets that made us look like a small hill. Harold took up most of the foot space and snored like a confession. We woke to frost on the inside of the windows and the sound of the repair truck's brakes. The man who stepped out of the truck wore a hat with ear flaps and the longest patience I had seen in a while. He fixed what was broken and then stood in our doorway and said, "You two take care of each other. Some houses are made out of more than wood." He left before we could reply, as if kindness is easier to deliver without applause. In the 3rd spring, Eli wrote a song for the church. He called it Gentle Hands. It was the kind of melody you could hum while chopping onions and feel like the onions had cried enough for both of you. He sang it on a Sunday when the light came in soft and the toddlers were full of fidgets. The 2nd verse said, "We are more than what we're mended. We are where the light gets in." And the congregation, which had learned to take what it needed and leave the rest, sang it back like an agreement. After the service, an older woman with a perfume that reminded me of my childhood Sunday school hugged Eli, as if a hug could vote yes. "You saved my week," she said. "I think I can make it to Wednesday now." We drove home and I watched him in profile, his hand steady on the wheel. I have loved many days, but that day is a favorite. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because the quiet was just right. We planted herbs. We read on the porch without speaking for an hour. We went to the grocery store and spent 10 minutes discussing tomatoes with a seriousness that would have baffled our college selves. That night, lying under the ceiling fan's slow blessing, he turned to me and said, "Do you know what I miss sometimes?" I braced, because sometimes that sentence is a door to a hard room. "Libraries," he said. We laughed, and later in the dark I reached for his hand and found it. We never stopped taking walks by the river. We never stopped leaving each other small notes, tucked into shoes or under pillows, or inside the pocket of a jacket you might not wear for a week, until one afternoon you slip it on and find a sentence that steadies you. Once, on a particularly hard day for me, news from a friend, the kind that leaves you standing in the kitchen with your hand on the counter like a brace, Eli left a scrap of paper on the sugar jar. It said, "I will hold your sorrow like it belongs here." He made tea and stood in the doorway with me until my breathing remembered where to go. He did not ask me to hurry. He did not try to fix what was not a fix. He believed me. We attended funerals together because that is part of loving a place. We brought casseroles because there are rituals you honor, whether they make sense or not. We sat on front porches with people who needed the porch to be a confessional, and he played softly while I listened with both ears. We learned to let the people we loved teach us how to love them. Sometimes that meant we said yes to things we didn't need to understand. Sometimes it meant saying no with gentleness. Always it meant understanding that love, like faith, asks you to stay for the questions. Years from that first Sunday, years from the river path, years from the library dust and the hand that reached for mine like a question. We bought a second-hand table that had been someone else's before and would be ours now. We carried it through our front door and set it down and both stepped back like we were trying to see our future from a polite distance. We ran our hands over the nicks and the places where a fork had gotten bossy and left a reminder. "It's not new," the seller had said apologetically. "It doesn't have to be," we had answered together, surprising even ourselves. We invited the people who had held our story for us to come and eat at that table. My mother brought rolls so soft they collapsed in the grip of the unprepared. His sister arrived with a salad that looked like confetti. Two friends from the city drove in with a dessert that had more layers than our patience. Pastor Green came with a stack of plates and a heart that had learned new steps. He hugged us both in the doorway and whispered to me, "Because I think he wanted to say it out of the wind. I thank God for the way you love my son." I whispered back, "Because that felt right. I thank God for the way he loves me." We ate. We laughed. We told the same stories we always tell and heard new ones. At one point, Eli's mother clinked her glass and said, "To the boys who made room on our table, if for joy," and everybody pretended not to wipe their eyes. If you had told me years ago that my life would look like this, simple and kind and sturdy and bright in places that used to feel dim, I would have been suspicious. I would have asked what I had done to deserve it. The truth is, I didn't earn it. We chose it. We kept choosing it. We set our intentions like places at the table, and then sat down and did the work of eating the meal. We apologized when we needed to. We learned to fold towels the way the other liked, not because towels mattered so much, but because tenderness does. We learned that secrets can keep you safe for a time, and stories can set you free, and that love, at its most practical, is the decision to care for someone's ordinary days. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the dog has decided sleep is an art form, I walk through the rooms and touch the things that feel like gratitude. The lamp Arthur fixed, the chair I refinished one summer when the afternoons were long, the guitar at the ready by the bookshelf, the curtain my mother hung, the photo on the refrigerator of us at the lake, our feet in the water, our faces bright with a kind of relief. I think about that boy I was, standing after youth group with a cup of punch, convinced that if he made himself very useful, his heart would behave. I think about the man I am, standing in a kitchen that knows my name, loving a man who learned to let faith and truth sit on the same couch. The path here wasn't straight. It was a river path, muddy at times, full of turns that made you think you were walking away from what you wanted, only to find it again around the bend. If you're listening to this with a heart that feels like it has 1,000 do not touch signs hanging from it, I want to tell you this. There is a gentle way forward. It might not be loud. It might not be fast. It might require you to find the door that has the least paint on it and press your ear to it for a while. But it is there. Sometimes it looks like a hand reaching for yours, as if asking a question. Sometimes it looks like a pastor learning to love his son more specifically. Sometimes it looks like a table with a scratch down the middle and two plates pulled close. We did not change the world. We changed our world. We made a home inside a place that once made us small and found that the rooms could stretch. We baked bread. We taught classes. We repaired lamps. We learned that love is less a secret kept in the dark and more a candle held in a steady palm. People will tell their versions. Let them. The story that matters is the one you live quietly, with the person who knows the sound your key makes in the door and who still looks up every time to see you come in.